Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is Monday, day 380, March 26th, 2018. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, as a lot of you know, I pay very close attention to what's been going on with Papadopoulos. I'm talking about George Papadopoulos. And as most of you know, of all the characters involved in this plot, he's one of the more interesting characters because everyone's trying to figure out exactly what he was and where he came from. Most of us believe he was some kind of a plant. And, of course, some people think he came from the Clinton inner circle. Some people possibly his connections to CIA. Brennan may have plugged him in. The FBI may have plugged him in. As most of you know, in the past few weeks, as I looked more into Mr. Clovis, who's the one who brought him into the campaign, and I began to look at the people who Papadopoulos associates with and where he comes from, it's appeared to me that he came, that he came more from the Republican or neoconservative or Republican establishment, Bush establishment gang of people. And it kind of made sense to me because, as I mentioned before, back in the South Carolina debate, when Trump went after Jeb Bush and then George W. Bush and said, well, your brother lied, I don't feel any safer. He said there was weapons of mass destruction when there were none. And if you remember, the camera panned back to the back of the room and you had old George Herbert Walker Bush look at Trump and go, the hand across the throat, the cut your throat signal is what he was giving Trump. So, the Bushes are those types of people. We know they're very close with the Clintons. And so for that reason, and looking at where Clovis comes from, it appeared to me that Papadopoulos most likely was the Bush contribution to the whole setup. And then, of course, you've got those connections with David Kramer, who, of course, his relationship and background is out of the Bush stable, even though most people are associating him with McCain because he's at the McCain Institute. Really, David J. Kramer's roots and where he's been is primarily Bush people. And so I begin to see this, where it began to look a lot more to me like Papadopoulos was a plant that came from the Bush side of the equation. And it's becoming more obvious, as I have suspected for quite some time, that Papadopoulos was inserted to be used. But I'm more convinced than ever that Papadopoulos was not in on it. He did not know. He just probably thought that he got recruited for this job because he had the experience and the political chops, that he was ready for this type of a gig. And so he probably thought, okay, yeah, this is great. I got this good gig. I'm going to be part of this presidential administration. I'm moving up in the world. I got a hand up from this guy Clovis, who obviously heard about me from someone. And so, Papadopoulos probably just believes that he's getting an opportunity. He probably has no idea why he's being recruited and put in here. But he's being put in for a specific purpose. He's going to be used. He's going to be used, and he doesn't even know it. This is what it looks like to me. So, today, we get some new information. Coming to us from the investigative unit of the Daily Caller. And from Chuck Ross on this particular story. And what we see here is another Bush connection tied to Papadopoulos and the Trump campaign. Another player, another individual who has ties and connections to the Bushes, to Cheney, to Rumsfeld. Another guy pops up who's also deeply connected in the intelligence community. So this person's name has popped up on the radar scale. So we have a new name to talk about. This individual is named Stefan K. Halper, Halper. Stefan Halper. He is a foreign policy expert, a Cambridge professor. He has connections to the CIA and MI6. He was a veteran of 3 Republican administrations. He worked on several projects for the Department of Defense, in which he was paid $928,000. He also worked in the Department of State, Justice, and Defense in those 3 previous administrations, Republican administrations. He is close friends with Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, which is the British version of the CIA. Dearlove, of course, as we learned, met with Christopher Steele while he was working on the dossier during the summer of 2016. We also know that Halper's father was Ray Klein, who was a CIA officer, and in fact, he was the CIA's top analyst during the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. He was a foreign policy advisor. Now I'm talking about Halper. Stephen Halper was a foreign policy advisor to the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, or actually to the campaign of 1980, where he was defeated by Reagan and served as vice president. So in 1980 he ran for president, but Reagan beat him in the primary, and but he became Reagan's VP. And Halper worked on that campaign. Halper, during the summer of 2016, made several requests for meetings with Papadopoulos months before the election. Halper first contacted Papadopoulos on September the 2nd, 2016, by email to ask Papadopoulos to write a report on issues related to Turkey, Cyprus, Israel, and the Leviathan gas field. Harper then arranged a meeting with Papadopoulos in London, where Halper offered to pay Papadopoulos' flight and 3 nights of stay in London, which he did, and they met all 3 days during that trip to London. So Papadopoulos met 3 times with Stephen K. Halper in London during that 3-day meeting. And we learned from someone who's close to Papadopoulos, who spoke with the Daily Caller investigative unit, which told them that Papadopoulos' take on Halper was that he was very suspicious of him. He didn't know exactly why Halper was contacting him or where he got his contact information. So Papadopoulos was a little bit curious why this guy Halper comes out of the woodwork, sends him an email, wants to have these meetings, and he got even more suspicious of him. Papadopoulos got more suspicious of Mr. Halper when, upon their first meeting, Halper looks over at Papadopoulos and says, "So, you know about the hacking of the emails from Russia, right?" At which point, Papadopoulos allegedly told Halper that he didn't know anything about any hacked emails from Russia or anything like that. At which point, Halper then got off the topic and moved on to other things. We also learned that Halper had contacted Carter Page and had encouraged him to attend a July 2016 symposium at Cambridge, where Halper is a regular lecturer. So he had contacts not only with Papadopoulos, but also with Carter Page. And so he's just this kind of mysterious man with these ties to the intelligence community, to the Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney trifecta, these neocons. He's probably, we can assume, knows Kramer quite well. They run in the same circles, know the same people. So just another interesting character that pops up, that was another person who was putting himself into contact with Papadopoulos to get or give information to Papadopoulos so that they could have Papadopoulos do what he does, which is to basically try to set up these meetings with Russia and to have these meetings with these various people and to look like he was some kind of a shaker and mover and a part of these things going on. Also in a key position because he's spending a lot of the time in Europe, specifically in London, during the summer and fall of 2016, where he is able to cross paths with all these individuals, who are said to be sources in the dossier. He's coming across people like Downer. He's coming across all these people in this intelligence deep state sort of thing, and Papadopoulos is just like being sort of used. I mean, he's just sort of a person that's been planted in there who can be manipulated to do things that would be suspicious and would suggest that that he, being a part of the Trump campaign, meeting with Russians, talking about Russia, set up meetings with Russia, do this, do that, Russia, Russia, Russia. And so this is what it appears. But even we learn here from the source close to Papadopoulos that even Papadopoulos was suspicious of, and at some point, I mean, he had to start adding two and two together, and he had to start thinking, I'm coming into contact with an awful lot of strange things going on around me. People talking about, Russian stolen emails and all this kind of stuff. I mean, where's this all coming from? And then I bump into this guy, and then I got these people feeding me information, and all these people who are from the intelligence community, deep state types, are wanting to have meetings with me, and, I'm being prompted to set these meetings up with Russians. So, I mean, Papadopoulos had to, at some point, I would think, begin to be very suspicious about how he felt like he was probably being manipulated and kind of worked around. But he probably didn't understand exactly at the time, in real time, as this is all happening to him, probably doesn't understand exactly what's going on. He's just kind of going with the flow. And, probably, trying to do the best he can because he's been given an opportunity. He wants to make good on it. He's being very aggressive. He thinks, okay, this is good for my career. I could be part of the Trump administration. So, yeah, I mean, he's probably, I really don't think Papadopoulos, was a plant that was, working for the Black Hats, and that he was part of this operation. I believe he was plugged in there, and that he believed, that he was just, getting an opportunity. I don't think Papadopoulos was an active participant. I think he was put in there, and he was used and manipulated. We also learn something else, which has been mentioned before, but it's been kind of doubled down on here. And we've all wondered about how this whole interaction with Alexander Downer comes about. I mean, how does Papadopoulos find himself in a London bar with a high-level official like Downer, deep ties to the intelligence community once again? How does that all happen? and then they have this conversation alleged about stolen Russian emails, which we don't even know if that's even true. But anyway, this all comes up. So now we're learning that that it was actually an Israeli embassy official that introduced Papadopoulos to Alexander Downer. So we have this individual whose name we do not have. We just know it was an Israeli embassy official that introduced Papadopoulos to Alexander Downer. Shouldn't surprise us, because we know about the close relationship between the neocons, Bush, and the Israelis. That's easy connection to draw. But it was apparently Alexander Downer who requested the meeting with Papadopoulos. So here again, we have Papadopoulos. He's getting contacted by guys like Mr. Halper. He's getting contacted by guys like Mr. Misford, by these various other people. And here he gets contacted again by Alexander Downer. He gets introduced to him, and then Downer wants to have contact with him and maybe have a drink in a London bar. So again, we can see that it was other people who were injecting themselves into Papadopoulos' orbit. They've got him there. They've got him in London. They've got him bouncing around. He's going to the spy school in Italy, and then he bounces over to Cyprus, and he's from that area. His family's from that area. He's interested in politics, has connections to local politics in the area. He comes out of the think tank. So then he's back in London, and he's and he's being contacted by Clovis, is constantly contacting him, pushing him to set up meetings with Russians. He's being contacted by Alexander Downer, who was introduced to him by an Israeli embassy official, who obviously wants to talk about stolen emails or something of the such. Then he's getting contacted by this guy, Halper, who's, of course, ties to the intelligence community, and also has ties to Mr. Breedlove, the former MI6 head, who, of course, met with Christopher Steele during the 2016 election to talk about the dossier. So here is what it looks like. You've got Papadopoulos. It's all these people coming into his orbit. I mean, it's not Papadopoulos going to them. It's Clovis who's emailing him all the time, putting him up to this stuff. It's other people coming into his orbit and motivating him and prodding him and giving him information. And so he's really just being used and manipulated for a call, for something that was obviously meant to be used later, and eventually was used later, because now they say, okay, well, this was the reason for the investigation, despite the fact that nowhere in any of the FISA court documents or applications or anything for any of the FISA warrants did they ever even mention Papadopoulos. And they don't even have an interest in even interviewing him until January of 2017, despite that all this is going on. Now it appears that the Daily Caller has tried to contact Mr. Halper, and at this time Mr. Halper has not returned their calls. So he's not interested in talking about his connection, but his name has come up and is part of the overall investigations looking into the dossier, how that all got put together, and all the various people and the contacts and this and that. So, but it's just more evidence of what I've been suspicious of now for quite a few weeks, which is that the Bushes may have had some role to play, and that Papadopoulos may have been one of their boys that came out of the Bush stable of people who were probably connected to McCain and Kramer, and so they had their own angle on it as well. And that's how vast this conspiracy looks. And we have to keep in mind that the Bushes were heavily anti-Trump. I mean, Trump destroyed Jeb Bush, and of course we remember the, George Herbert Walker Bush giving that signal, so you can bet that they didn't let go of it, and that they had probably some role to play, and it's looking more and more like Papadopoulos came from that wing. But he was just another person in the mix, and it's looking more and more like Papadopoulos was a plant, but he didn't know that he was a plant. He was simply thrown in there and then manipulated and used for the purpose, which was to help sell the Russia-Trump collusion story, and so he was in the mix. So that's what we learn about. That's the new thing that we learn. Now, it is Monday, so we should talk about the Dumbass of the Week. Now, this week's Dumbass of the Week is a first-time winner. Not that he's the first time he's ever been a dumbass, because he's been a dumbass for a very long time. But it's the first time he's been given this award here on TowerGate. So, to this week's Dumbass of the Week, we have the Canadian-born, washed-up pop artist, Neil Young, who is the latest of these idiots to make violent threats against President Trump. So he recently, giving an interview, stated that Trump was a lowlife and an animal, and said he wanted him gone by any means necessary. Of course, we know that Neil Young was a hardcore Bernie supporter. He's a hardcore climate change activist, a radical environmental wacko commie. He specializes in bashing America. One thing that Neil Young should remember is that over 60 million people voted for Trump. So when you come out and call the president a lowlife and an animal, and you say you want him gone by any means necessary, you're essentially speaking to 60 million people who voted for him as well. They take it personally. That's the guy they voted for. So I don't know how that's going to work out for Neil Young, but it probably doesn't matter because he spends most of his time bitching these days about how artists get ripped off and the big record industry doesn't pay them what they should because so much of their music is available free online. And so they're not making the money they should make, and blah, 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 which there is some truth to that. I mean, there's no question that the music industry certainly changed, an industry I was a part of for some time when I was a much younger man. And yeah, it certainly has changed. It's a lot different. There's pros and cons and that whole 9 yards. But I have no problem with his position on that sort of thing. I mean, he has a right to make that comment. But again, these types of comments, that if they were made against Barack Obama, certainly you can imagine the left-wing media would be insane, going crazy and jumping all over this person. But because it's Neil Young saying that he wants Trump gone by any means necessary, of course he will get interviews and he will get pats on the back. He will be lauded as a great American hero when in fact he's none of that. He's just another leftover hippie commie from the 1960s who's butthurt because the rotten Reverend Clinton lost the election and communism has been put on hold for a while. But again, the important thing to keep in mind here, if you're Neil Young, is that you are actually insulting. It's one thing to insult the president and suggest a violent action against him, but you're also greatly insulting 60 million people, because you're saying that 60 million people voted for an animal who's a lowlife and who should be taken out by any means necessary. That's what you're saying to 60 million people, and needless to say, it's comments like that that will land you right on my dumbass of the week here on TowerGate. There you go, Neil Young, dumbass of the week. Now, with the little time I have left, I want to do a little speculation. Because we're in kind of this lull period. Things are going to get kind of boring here for probably, the next 2 or 3 weeks until the IG report comes out. It's this like kind of almost eerie, calm before the storm. It's like we all know what's coming. We know it's coming because of what's already been released. Horowitz didn't drop those page and Strzok texts on us, giving us all that information only to whet our palates, then to deliver nothing. Okay? All the things that we've learned from what has been passed from the IG over to the DOJ and what has found its way into the Nunes memo and in some of the information that's come out in these congressional hearings, this has almost all come from the IG. So keep in mind that the House Judiciary, House Intel Committee, they've only received a few thousand of the texts that they have requested. The IG has 1.2 million. Many of them have been turned over to the Department of Justice, but they're going through them and trying to stonewall and delay as much as possible getting those to the committees. But just think what the IG must know. We have seen a few thousand of those texts. His people have seen over 1 million of those texts. Think about that. From what we know, think what he knows. What else he's seen. Probably a lot. We know that he has a staff of over 400 people, of lawyers and investigators. And they've probably, over the last year and 3 months, have looked at a lot of things. And we can see what has happened just since the first of the year with various individuals. So now what I want to do is I want to speculate a little bit on what we can expect with some of these people who we've talked about and some of these people we haven't really talked about, just so we get an idea of who might be caught up in this just within the FBI and DOJ. This is not even really in the intelligence community. This is really not even any of those people. This is just the DOJ and the FBI and Horowitz's investigation into what went on there. So there's a couple things that Horowitz has been told that he's to be looking into. When this whole thing first started a year and 3-4 months ago, it was primarily that he was supposed to look into the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation. That was where it started. Then it expanded into FISA abuses as well. Then the leakers, specifically the leaks to the media, was another thing that was added on his list to look into. And then, of course, the larger issue that's come into play recently, since we've learned about the insurance policy and all that sort of stuff, is this wider conspiracy by FBI and DOJ officials to frame the president. Okay, so these are basically the areas where Inspector General Horowitz and his investigators have been working. Now, there are really two things that the Inspector General is going to be focused on in his report. Number one thing is going to be providing evidence of misconduct and political bias. Evidence of misconduct and political bias, which may or may not be criminal. Then, of course, we have the second thing he's looking into, which would be evidence of illegal activity. And from those two things, he will make recommendations. And we know that he's got a prosecutor, outside prosecutor, working with him right now. Probably grand jury has been convened. They've probably heard testimony from witnesses. They've obviously turned a few of these people. So I'm going to go focus on these people right now. Who some of the people are, the ones that may have been turned, the ones that we can expect are going to get some sort of leniency in their sentencing in exchange for cooperation. And then those are probably going to be the targets. Now, we know that Peter's been stroking us along with Lisa Page, Bruce Orr, Mr. Baker, and Bill Priestep all appear to have cut some sort of a leniency deal with this prosecutor. And so they are the ones that are most likely going to give up the people above them, and that would be this group that became known as the small group, which consisted of the following individuals: Mike Corton, David Loffman, Sally Yates, James Rybicki, Andrew McCabe, and of course Comey at the top of that. And so it's these individuals who have all been fired, meaning these individuals either weren't given the opportunity to cut a deal because they're the targets of the people who already cut the deal, or because they had been fired and therefore they couldn't be interviewed by the Inspector General. But they're probably the targets and the people who have not got deals, at least not yet. Now, once indictments start coming down, some of these people may start singing like a bird, and they'll start turning on each other. But for the time being, the only people that we can suspect at this point that have cut deals for leniency would be Strzok, Page, or Baker and Priestep. They're all still there at the FBI or DOJ. But Corton, Loffman, Yates, Rybicki, and McCabe and Comey have all been fired or have left. So these are probably the individuals who are going to be, right after the IG report comes out and and his recommendations are there, these are probably the people who are going to be the first ones in that first tier who are going to be indicted. This is my opinion that I'm giving you now. This is my opinion. But there's also these other people on the peripheral who will probably also be involved and could also face indictment. These individuals would be John Carlin, Mary McCord, Mary Jacoby, Lisa Monaco, Rachel Brand, Josh Campbell, Trish Anderson, Greg Bauer, and Sally Moyer. All these individuals are like second-tier people who were behind the small group, who were also involved, knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly involved in part of this conspiracy to conduct the counterintelligence operation, the frame-up, the insurance policy, whatever you want to call it. These are people who will all likely be implicated by the Inspector General in his report. These people will then all lead to the big fish. This would be the people who are in the cabinet, the administration, Obama's administration, which would include Obama himself, is the biggest fish because he had to know all this is going on. And of course we know that because we had that text from Loose Lisa Page telling Peter, who's been stroking us, that, hey, the president, the POTUS, wants to know everything about what we're doing in the investigation. They were talking about the Trump-Russia investigation. POTUS wants to know everything. You bet he did, and a lot of this was showing up in his PDBs, his presidential daily briefings. So the big fish that you'll get to from the people who have cut deals and other people who will be cutting deals once the indictments come down, and where this is going to eventually lead all the way to the top, is going to go right to the top, which would be Comey, McCabe, Brennan, Clapper, Sally Yates, Loretta Lynch, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, Ben Rhodes, and Obama himself. And then, of course, the next stage of that, once you get to this point, is then when they finally tie together the Clinton campaign to the Obama administration, where that collaboration, how it began, how extensive it was, how deep the involvement was, and that type of thing, how all that came about. And that will likely require a special counsel investigation, because you're going to need to interview people outside just the FBI, the DOJ, people who are no longer around, people not even working in the administration, like a Jonathan Weiner, like a Cody Shearer, like this other guy over in London who was feeding Christopher Steele, maybe Mr. Downer, other people like that. So you're going to need someone who can look at the wider issues. But I think the first stage of this is when the IG report comes out and we see that these people I just mentioned are all going to be within the IG's web. These are all the people that could fall into criminal indictment based on the fact of either evidence of illegal activity or evidence of misconduct and political bias. And the recommendations will be, of course, based on whether or not we're talking about a crime or just things they did that they shouldn't have done, misconduct, things like that. So this is where it's going to start. And as soon as the IG report comes out, I expect that that's exactly what will happen. It won't take long following that for the first indictments to come down on these people. And eventually it will work its way all the way into the big fish who I just mentioned inside the Obama administration. And then once the special counsel comes in and begins looking at the wider picture, the bigger picture, that there was an attempted sort of coup or frame up or whatever you want to call it, insurance policy, once they begin to look at that, and as soon as they begin to tie the Clinton campaign, and if it can actually be proven that this was a formulated plot from the very beginning, that there was active collaboration going on between and collusion going on between the Clinton people and the Clinton campaign officials and the administration, and it certainly appears there was. We have multiple points of linkage, whether it's Mary Jacoby and her relationship with the Clintons, her paying a visit over to the White House back in April of 2016. A week later, we get Fusion GPS is hired by the Clinton campaign. Then they bring in Nellie Orr. She gets her ham radio. Then here comes Christopher Steele. Then we got Jonathan Weiner feeding information to Steele, coming directly from Cody Shearer and Sidney Blumenthal. Total Clinton inside confidence. Victoria Nuland given the okay to go ahead and pass this information on to the FBI. So we can see that it appears the Clinton campaign used the State Department as a way of moving the opposition research phony dossier into the law enforcement and intelligence community, of course, with the Association of Brennan and the intelligence spooks. Now, of course, we probably have some of the Bush people working with the Clinton people, doing their part. So a lot of different moving parts that have to be looked at and analyzed and fleshed out could take some time. But I think that this is where it's going to start, and I think once it begins, it's going to be like a domino effect. It's just going to start collapsing as the dominoes go, and it's going to be a wild, wild year. But we're in the calm period right now, so everything's all nice and cool, but believe me, things are going to heat up here very soon. You guys have a good night. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.